Hello, my dear friend. Tonight, we are together again on Histo Past Forward. Tonight's story traces a silence that has remained in the shadow of time and is carved into stones. Its name? The Watchers of Babylon. Were they the same beings as the fallen angels in the Bible and the Quran? This is a journey filled with secrets hidden beneath the stars, the sound of iron, and words that should never be spoken. But don't be afraid. Everything is very slow, very simple, and belongs only to the night. Now, I will ask you for one small thing. Please, dim the lights a little. Pull your blanket over you. And slowly close your eyes. This long and peaceful journey is beginning. Everything begins with a journey, and some journeys, even if they don't appear on maps, leave their mark throughout history. Now close your eyes and imagine time flowing backward. You are around 2500 BCE. Neither today's borders nor satellite images exist. There are only two great civilizations, one in the east, risen in the floodplains of the Indus Valley, the other in the west, Mesopotamia, molded from mud and sun between the Euphrates and Tigris. Although thousands of kilometers separated them, these two worlds had silently begun to touch each other. You enter this story with a morning that begins on the deck of a cargo ship. The ship's construction is rough but functional. It has just departed from the port of Lothal. On the edge of the port, the mud is still soft in the morning coolness. The ship has a broad hull, resin-coated over a wooden frame. In its cargo hold are sacks filled with barley, lentils, precious stones, and a few polished seals. The oarsmen have just finished their morning prayers. The wind blows gently from the east, and the shore gradually fades from view. Although this journey seems like an ordinary trade expedition, what it carries is not just material value. This ship also carries a silent relationship developing between two civilizations. Trade routes are usually established not by great victories, but by small rituals. Those who take the first step are often people whose names are forgotten: boatmen, porters, translators, merchants, patiently waiting for an agreement. At this point, you might ask yourself, how did these two great civilizations come to need each other? The people of the Indus Valley had skillfully developed agriculture thanks to abundant water and regular floods. Cities like Lothal, Dholavira, and Harappa were ahead of their contemporaries with their orderly streets, sewage systems, and massive storage areas. Barley, wheat, and linseed oil production was in surplus. But copper was limited. In Mesopotamia, it was the opposite. Access to resources like copper, stone, and timber was easier. But sometimes famine would strike. Mesopotamia did not have a reliable flood system like the Nile. The climate was harsher. War was closer. Thus, needs and surpluses formed a network. Just as in today's global economies thousands of years ago, people learned to exchange. But records of this exchange are very few. We only have seals, pottery fragments, weights, and a few broken inscriptions. Let's open one of the sacks on that ship with you. A tiny stone seal emerges from it. On it are figures resembling Indus symbols, a bull motif, and 4 vertical lines. This seal will be given to a merchant in the Mesopotamian port of Dilmun or perhaps to indicate the origin of a product, perhaps as a sign of trust. Seals represented trust before contracts were written, and trust is the most expensive commodity in any trade. The journey lasts for days. The ship, departing from Lothal, crosses the Arabian Sea westward, heading towards the Persian Gulf. Its route parallels the coast of what is now Oman. Along the way, it stops at many small ports: Dilmun, Makan, Margan. These are ancient trade centers mentioned in Mesopotamian sources, but whose exact locations are unknown. Each lives with its own small communities, sometimes focused on pottery, sometimes settlements that only produce salt. But what catches your attention is the silence of the people in these ports during trade. No talking, signs, gestures, facial expressions. There was no common language at that time. The Indus script has not yet been deciphered. Mesopotamian cuneiform was in the hands of very few, and writing belonged only to the urban elite. In the ports there was another language of communication: hand movements, the way objects were placed, eye contact. Another day you are in the port of Dilmun. The ship will stay here for a few days. Local people come to see the goods. A man picks up a sack of lentils, brings it to his nose, smells it. In return, he offers a small copper bracelet. The bracelet is hot forged with a curled end. The merchant nods his head. No handshake, but eye contact is made. The exchange is complete. At the campfire at night, there are no conversations, only the sounds of eating, the crackling of wood, and the distant howl of a jackal. This silence is not just a lack of language, it is also a habit of attention and observation. There is a crowd of people here trying to recognize what is different, each trying to understand the other's intentions. Trade is sometimes a solution that replaces war. If you can trade with someone you don't understand, you don't have to fight them. The next morning, the journey begins anew. The ship sails north towards the port cities of Mesopotamia. The city of was one of the liveliest trade centers of that period. The river network extended into the city itself. Boats could enter the streets. Ur's markets were filled with goods from different regions: lapis lazuli from Afghanistan, timber from Lebanon, olive oil from the north. And now there are also sacks from the east. When you disembark, Ur's port is crowded. Everyone is swift but orderly. Porters check the products, sometimes looking at the seals. Your eyes fall on a sack from the east. The symbol on the seal stops you: the Indus bull and the wave symbol. This indicates it came from the Indus Valley. At that moment you realize the people here now know the meaning of the seals by heart. So this trade is not a one-time experiment. It is part of a system that has been going on for years. But the silence of this system is striking. Neither inscriptions nor epics recount this connection. This relationship has not entered the stories of kings, gods, or wars, because here the story is written by those who came long before writing. A chance arriving at the port with the first light of dawn, young people carrying goods in a sweat, ship oarsmen, and women silently bargaining. Yet a question lingers in your mind. Why was such a silent, such an invisible relationship never spoken of loudly? Perhaps history's most important connections were the least spoken of. Ur's streets were narrow but orderly. When the sun struck the city walls, the stones gently released vapor, the morning coolness giving way to a heavy heat. The city seemed complex to outsiders, but was quite functional to insiders. Market areas were connected by narrow passages. Every corner held a different scent, a different sound. And a narrow street displaying goods from the east grew more crowded each day. As you walk down that street, something catches your attention. The stall with goods, seemingly from the Indus Valley, is quieter than the others. The seller there doesn't talk much, doesn't look directly at your face, but watches carefully. The small stone seals he holds in his hand are arranged in a specific order on the cloth spread on the ground. The distances between them are equal, their orientations the same, just like the planned streets of Indus cities, as if trade carries not just products but also culture. You approach and extend your hands to the stones. One is smooth, the other embossed. The embossing has a water wave motif. You recall the sea routes you saw earlier. Perhaps this symbolizes the direction the ship came from, or perhaps it's just decoration. But what strikes you is that the meaning is not fully deciphered. The communication is not fully established, and yet things work. At that moment you realize Mesopotamia's own internal order was not shaken by this external contact. On the contrary, it expanded. The local people quickly adapted to these foreign products. New tastes, new fabrics, different stones, new decorative motifs. But more importantly, how this change transformed daily life. Perhaps a housewife is using an Indus stone as a grinder for the first time. Perhaps a carpenter is making a mold from a newly arrived copper bracelet. Small influences are the beginning of great currents. As the day progresses and the market quietly disperses, you walk towards the inner neighborhoods of Ur. Children play among houses with high walls. Some wear stone beads on a thin string around their necks. The beads surprisingly resemble those used in the Indus Valley. Transparent stones, some purplish, some orange. Could these be more than just ornaments? Perhaps a status symbol, perhaps a religious sign, perhaps just beauty. But whatever they are now hanging around a Mesopotamian child's neck. You lean against the corner of a wall and watch the neighborhood. A baker lifts the lid of a tandoor. A young man carries water with earthen jars. A woman washes the paving stones, and all, unconsciously, bear small traces of foreign influences, a new spice used in the kitchen, a new shaped pot hung on the doorframe, a stone ornament on the windowsill. Culture is not spread in official documents. It's something that permeates through carried objects, habits, and daily choices. The next morning, before you leave the city, you walk towards Ur's temple. The ziggurat is a giant structure shining with the morning sun. It stares along, its shadow deep. The temple priests are inside, not outside. But in the courtyard you witness an interesting scene. A priest's assistant carefully examines a newly arrived seal stone. He whispers something to the scribe next to him. The scribe takes notes on a small tablet in cuneiform. They may not have fully understood the shapes on the seal, but that stone is now entering Mesopotamia's written records. Something nameless is becoming an official record. Suddenly, the question comes to your mind: does this seal represent a product, a person, or an idea? The answer is not clear. But that seal will now be kept on a shelf in a Mesopotamian temple. Perhaps it will remain there for hundreds of years. Perhaps one day a future archaeologist will unearth it, photograph it, place it in a museum display case. And people, when they know that stone came from the Indus, will reconsider this relationship. Before leaving Ur, you visit the marketplace one last time. Yesterday's stones have dwindled. Only 2 seals remain on the stall now. The seller narrows his eyes. He extends his hand, opens his palm. Inside is another stone. This one is different. The marks on it are circular and symmetrical. It must have come from another Indus city. The seller doesn't know what the stone tells, but he senses it carries meaning. He holds it for a moment, then places it on the ground, next to the other seals. And at that moment you realize history is not just the story of kings or wars. Sometimes a stone, a glance, or a gesture establishes a relationship spanning thousands of kilometers, silently through eye contact. But then your curiosity grows. Why did this relationship always remain so silent? Why does no Mesopotamian epic speak of those who came from the Indus? And why does no Indus tablet mention Mesopotamia? As you leave you feel that what is left behind is not just stones or fabrics. The ship is being prepared again. The return journey is about to begin. But now not just goods are being transported, now those returning carry a city in their minds, the scent of the order of its market, the shadow of its temple, and perhaps a few habits too. The making of a pot, the temperature measure of an oven, a method of weighing. People transform each other unconsciously. The ship's captain plans to go faster on the return journey. The wind direction is favorable. But a question is in his mind. Who will understand these goods when they return? Because every culture has its own way of reading. And how will these Mesopotamian goods returning to the Indus be interpreted there? What will the figures on the stones tell there? During conversations with merchants on board along the way, the absence of a common language is noticed again. But this lack is not an obstacle. On the contrary, people fill this void with gestures, repetitions, and patience. The duration of a glance lengthens, a hand movement becomes more distinct. Communication is slow but effective, and this slowness brings attention. Everything is chosen, placed, and conveyed more carefully. The permanence of culture also comes from this. Upon arrival in Lothal, the shoreline is blurred by the morning mist. Children are waiting by the edge of the harbour. When the ship docks, everyone moves to unload the cargo. Although everything looks familiar, there are small differences in the incoming goods. Mesopotamian pottery stands out with sharper bases and different seal impressions. A potter runs his fingers over a newly arrived jar. The clay's structure is different, its color darker. But he respects the craftsmanship. He takes the jar to his workshop. Perhaps he will try that shape in his next products. Similarly, the stone bead master looks at the newly arrived purple beads. He checks their hardness. He examines the placement of the holes. The beads are in an arrangement unfamiliar to him. But this difference is not rejected. On the contrary, it inspires. The way the master strings the beads that night may well change the fashion in Lothal. These small things can in time be the beginning of great changes, but something that is still missing. The story of these changes is not told. There is no inscription, no oral legend. Everything proceeds through objects. Silence takes the place of narrative, and you realize that the contact between these two great civilizations always took place beyond borders. Not by royal decree, not by war, not by colonization, only by mutual needs, by mutual understanding. Therefore, it was silent yet strong. One day, during an archaeological excavation in the inner regions of the Indus, a Mesopotamian-style seal is found. The cuneiform on it has been read from the market of But this seal is found not in Lothal, it is much further inland in Dolavira, next to a child's grave. What does this mean? Did trade reach not only the ports but also the inner regions, or was this seal a toy, a talisman, an inheritance? Similarly, in Mesopotamia, Indus-type weights are unearthed in an excavation. Their standards are almost identical. Yet there was no federation between these civilizations, no common legal system. But the weights were the same. How can this be explained? Perhaps history is not always written with grand agreements, but with small harmonies. And these harmonies are sometimes stronger than words. Finally, let's walk together to one of the cemeteries. In the Indus Valley, graves are simple, while in Mesopotamia they are a little more ceremonial. But in both, one thing stands out. Objects left with the dead. A bowl, a seal, a stone. These people saw objects as not just functional, but also meaningful. And perhaps that is why trade was not just an economic, but a cultural movement. Today those seals sit in museums. What is written on them is not fully known, But what they tell is very clear, traces of a silent contact, never loudly recounted, because their voice was hidden in the weight of stones, the shape of pots, the dust of roads. And now, you might still be wondering, why were these two great civilizations so tall? Lose yet never truly belonged to each other. They touched each other but never merged.
Why did this silent bond suddenly break one day and disappear from history? Perhaps we should seek the answer in the next chapter. As the morning sun slowly hit the stone walls of Dolavira, thick shadows fell on the narrow streets. This city had been built as one of the most remarkable settlements in the Indus Valley. Neatly placed stone blocks, wide streets, and systematic canal structures showed that the inhabitants here were deeply involved not only in agriculture but also in administration and organization. The city was clearly established according to a plan. But who owned this plan? We still don't know. You are on the way to the city's administrative center. On the ground, amidst the stone pavements, a small object glints, catching your attention. You bend down and pick it up. A worn but still legible stone seal. On it is a bull figure and unknown symbols placed above it. The seal is about 2 centimeters in diameter, polished and carefully carved. This seal might have been used to indicate where a good or a shipment came from, or to whom it belonged. Perhaps it was just a sign of ownership. But the meaning of the marks on the stone is still unknown today. The Indus script is one of the most fascinating among undeciphered languages. There are hundreds of symbols, but none directly match a language we know. How sentences were formed, how words were separated, is even unknown. And the most interesting thing is these writings are mostly found on seals. That is, they are not permanent texts, but portable symbols. When you hold this seal in your hand, you feel that you are holding not just a stone, but also a message. Not a word, perhaps, but an intention. And this intention might have been carried thousands of kilometers away to another civilization. In Mesopotamia at that time, cuneiform had already become widespread. Although Hammurabi's laws had not yet been, each seal, perhaps not a word, but could be understood like a sentence. So how was this system established? Probably over time, a habit of recognition developed based on repeated exchanges. When a merchant saw a seal a few times, he began to understand what goods it came with and what kind of quality it carried. Perhaps over time, some seals became more recognized, gained fame. Some seal masters even became more sought after in certain regions. Like brands today, a seal was a symbol of trust. Now, let's take you to the workshop of a seal master in Dolavira, a simple stone room, a stone carving stand in the middle, small stone blocks in the corner. The master, kneeling, works the stone with his tiny hammer and scraper. He carefully carves each line, circular motifs, linear figures, abstract symbols. He explains nothing to anyone while doing this, because the meaning of these symbols is known only between the buyer and the user, like a secret code. Sometimes the master makes special seals according to a merchant's request. Some want a ship figure, others a river symbol. The master communicates with the merchant only through hand gestures, no language is used. But that piece of stone will set off for Mesopotamia in a few days, and a person there seeing this seal, even if they don't fully decipher what it means, will realize that it tells something. These seals are sometimes attached to wooden handles, sometimes hung around the neck with ropes, and sometimes pressed onto the mouths of sacks. Each seal establishes a new connection wherever it goes, and these connections form a portable archive, not a written one. But then something catches your attention. Why are there so many seals but no explanation of their meaning? Why is there no dictionary or record anywhere that says, this symbol means this? These questions make you think. Perhaps these seals were not writing in the modern sense. Perhaps these symbols carried meanings that varied from person to person. In this case, seals were not a means of communication, but a symbol of belonging. And this belonging was quite important for both Indus and Mesopotamian societies, because ownership
control, responsibility, and trust were all embodied in these seals. Finally, I want to take you to a modern archaeological laboratory. In a museum storage, hundreds of seals are displayed under glass. All are small, silent, and motionless. But each, in its time, made a journey of thousands of kilometers. Each passed from one hand to another, perhaps pressed onto a bag, perhaps placed on the lid of a chest. And now here, in silence, they wait to be told. These seals may not be readable today, but the meanings they carried still whisper something. Once upon a time, two great civilizations silently recognized each other. And this recognition was written not with words, but with stones. But one more question remains. Why did these seals stop being pressed one day? Why did a silent system quietly disappear? As you walked through the back streets of Ur, shadows cast on stone walls slowly shifted with the morning sun. The dust in the air became visible, with the angle of the light reminding you that every step was part of a story etched into the city's stones for centuries. Here, urban life was shaped not only around temples and kings, but also around small shops filled with seals and silent workshops in narrow alleys. Turning a corner, an old man leaning against a wall catches your attention. In front of him is a flat stone table with clay tablets of different sizes and seals on it. The man presses a stone seal in his hand into a ball of clay, then lifts it to inspect the impression. If the impression isn't clear, he sets it aside and tries another. He repeats this movement dozens of times. Beaker. Use a seal is valuable not just for its beauty, but because it leaves a mark. That mark must inspire trust. You approach the man and watch silently. The seal in his hand resembles Indus seals, short lines, abstract symbols, and a bull figure. But this seal was produced in Mesopotamia because the stone type is different, the craftsmanship is softer, the frame more rounded. This means it's a recreation here of an idea that came from the East. Cultures imitate not only products, but also styles, and this imitation is often a sign of appreciation. The man turns to you, his eyes, as if wanting to tell something. He extends the seal in his hand. He points to the clay tablet he pressed. "New seal," he says, with a single word. He offers no other explanation for you to understand. But you feel the silent history behind this simple gesture. This seal is a symbol of an era, and this symbol is now reborn elsewhere. The widespread use of seals in Mesopotamia has surprised some historians, because Mesopotamia's own seal tradition is much older. Cylinder seals were used in temple rituals, administrative documents, and for marking personal belongings. These seals were rolled around to impress designs onto clay, but Indus seals are flat, square-shaped, and impressed with a single strike. So the methods are different, and yet traces of Indus-type seals have been found in some Mesopotamian cities. This situation may indicate more than mere practicality. Perhaps it is the result of curiosity, the allure of the foreign, the prestige offered by the different. Perhaps a merchant saw having an Indus seal as a privilege. Perhaps a priest thought he could reach other gods with these seals. Perhaps a father, giving this seal to his son, told him about distant lands. This small stone may once have touched the dreams of thousands. Over time, copies of these seals began to be made in Mesopotamia. However, these copies were never exact, because every culture transforms the foreign with its own understanding. When an Indus seal is pressed in Mesopotamia, it is no longer just an imitation, it is a bearer of local meaning. One day, near the northern gate of Ur, a small seal shop opens in a market area. A young artisan, inspired by an old Indus seal he came across, creates his own collection of seals. His customers are diverse. Some are merchants, some artisans, some simply collectors. Everyone wants a seal for themselves. The artisan designs new symbols by interpreting Indus symbols, perhaps without fully knowing their meanings but respecting their forms. And it is at this very point that history takes a peculiar turn, because these new seals are no longer representatives of Indus culture. They have become an aesthetic preference in Mesopotamia, like a motif whose origin is unknown but whose form is adopted. And at this point, you realize culture is not always transmitted through understanding. Sometimes it is simply felt, appreciated, reshaped. But this spread has a limit, because every motif is meaningful in its own context, and when context is lost, symbols become mere ornaments. Indus-type seals produced in Mesopotamia eventually begin to be seen as mere fashion items. They lose their commercial function. They become a means of display, not trust. Finally, a day comes when these seals are no longer part of new records. They are not used in commercial documents. They are not impressed in temples. They lose their value in marketplaces. Perhaps this is the first silent sign of a rupture. So why did this rupture happen? The answers are many, but none are definitive. Perhaps climate change, perhaps political turmoil, perhaps simply cultural saturation. But the most frequently cited possibility, the disruption of the Indus Valley's own internal order. Archaeological records show that Indus cities were eventually abandoned, infrastructure fell into disuse, and trade networks were cut. This led to the foreign seals in Mesopotamia losing their meaning. There are no more arrivals, no new seals are being pressed, the old ones are left to be silently forgotten. Do you remember the old seal maker in Ur? One day he packs up his stall, wraps the remaining seals in a cloth and closes his shop. No one asks him why, because everyone knows those seals no longer have meaning. But you know that every seal still carries a story, and those stories are silent questions not only of the past but also of today. Why do some cultural exchanges leave a mark while others silently fade away? And what might these impressions left by seals still be trying to tell us? One day in the mid-20th century, an archaeologist working at the Mohenjo-Daro excavation site in southeastern Pakistan, patiently cleaning the damp soil, came across a small square-shaped piece of stone. Its surface was worn, but a bull figure was still clear enough to be discernible. Below it, a series of strange symbols were lined up. Vertical lines, a triangle-like form, then a circle. The stone was hard, but the craftsmanship was surprisingly delicate. The archaeologist noticed a hole on the side of the stone. This was a seal, and it was not only functional but also a silent witness of an era. That stone seal was taken to a museum in London. It was placed in a glass display case. Below it, a small information card. 2500 BCE, Indus Valley, function not fully known. This short sentence clearly reveals how little we know, because this stone represents not only the ownership of the people of that period, but also a form of communication that we still cannot understand today. And behind that glass box, the seal silently waits, wondering if someone will decipher what it says. You are now a museum visitor. With a guide brochure in your hand, you walk slowly past the display cases. In one corner, cylinder seals from Mesopotamia, inscribed with cuneiform, full of god figure. Rares a few steps away, Indus seals, bull, hippopotamus, geometric patterns. And you realize that these two different types of seals, though completely unlike each other, perform the same function in the same era. in places close to the same lands. But why didn't these two systems fully blend? Many researchers have pursued this question, perhaps from different worldviews, perhaps from the separation of administrative structures, or perhaps a conscious boundary. But no one knows for sure. Mesopotamia kept writing under the control of an elite class, while the Indus Valley used its script in a more widespread and simpler form. This difference could also be decisive in the meaning of the seals. One was concerned with sovereignty and divine authority, while the other was more about practical identity definitions. An interesting feature of Indus seals is this: they do not usually carry long texts alongside them. There are short sequences of a single line or a few symbols. In this respect, they are more like signs than dictionaries. Some theories suggest that these seals were used for commercial purposes, while others propose they were related to religious ceremonies. But there is no definitive information, and this uncertainty makes every stone more mysterious. Now close your eyes. We are entering an archaeological laboratory. Microscopes, light boxes, notebooks. In the middle, arranged under glass, are 10 seals. Some of them came from Mesopotamia, some from the Indus Valley. All are silent, but each one reached another city, another port, another person. Those stones were once carried in hands, pressed in markets, placed at the mouths of sacks. Perhaps they gave someone trust, perhaps they resolved a dispute. And now, research conducted on these stones points to a new truth. There are direct similarities between these seals. The same geometric pattern in a different geography, the same bull figure on a different stone. This shows that not only trade, but also design was transported. The two civilizations may have shared not only products, but also ways of thinking. But then a problem arises. Why did this sharing suddenly stop? According to archaeological data, around 1900 BCE, great changes began in Indus cities. Canal systems collapsed, houses were abandoned, and trade volume decreased. Records from Mesopotamia also show a decline in the number of goods coming from the east. The variety of seals diminished. This marks the beginning of a silence, and one day, Indus seals no longer appear in Mesopotamian records. Today, archaeologists are trying to unravel this silence, but neither traces of war nor evidence of a major natural disaster are found. This is a contact that slowly, gradually diminished, and perhaps in this respect, it is one of history's most human stories. Because not every relationship ends loudly. Sometimes paths diverge, ships stop, seals are forgotten. But what remains? The stones in museums, the bulls under glass, forgotten symbols, and the eyes that observe them. As you leave the museum, you turn your head and look at the display case one last time. That small seal still rests in the same spot. Its surface is worn, but it still endures, as if it wants to tell you something. Perhaps what it cannot say is the most important missing piece of history that we are trying to understand. And that seal seems to whisper one last question to you. If words are not deciphered, what do we use to understand the past? And what might silent seals be trying to teach us without speaking? As morning was just breaking, a silence reigned by the water. In a small farming village nestled along the Gagahakra, a tributary of the Ganges River, a thin layer of mist hung over the fields. Farmers, waking before the roosters crowed, listened to the flow of the river. That sound, for them, was not just the sound of water. It was the sea's sound of life, time, and seed. On the same morning, thousands of kilometers to the west, a similar ritual took place in another settlement on the Euphrates bank in Mesopotamia. Here the farmers checked the water channels that had swollen overnight. If they were late, the soil would receive too much water, and yields would drop. If they acted too early, the surface of the soil would crack. Everything depended on timing and water. Water here was not just a natural resource, it was a combination of balance, hope, and fear. You are in this story on both sides. You go out for morning irrigation like a farmer in the Indus Valley, and you examine the notes of a canal master in Mesopotamia. Because the silent common ground of these two civilizations is an agricultural system built on the rhythm of rivers. And these systems, over time, began to communicate not only with the land, but also with each other. Agriculture in the Indus Valley relied heavily on floods. Monsoon rains would swell the rivers. These floods would leave nutrient-rich alluvium on the fields. This cycle repeated every year. However, uncontrolled flooding would lead to crop loss. For this reason, the Indus people built canals and reservoirs. The massive water pools in Dolavira were used not only for drinking water but also for irrigation, and this system required central oversight. That is, water management was also the management of society. In Mesopotamia, the situation was slightly different. The Euphrates and Tigris swelled not due to monsoons but due to snowmelt in the mountains. Floods varied not by season but by weather conditions. Therefore, Mesopotamians established more complex and long-term canal systems. Water was distributed from large centers through inter-village systems. At the head of this system were mostly priests or local rulers. Because controlling water meant controlling agriculture and somaes,
consequently life.
In both regions, water was not only a physical but also a cultural element. Water symbols seen on Indus seals, wave marks, curved lines, showed how dependent daily life was on water. In Mesopotamia, there were water gods, like Enki. Small temples were located at the head of canals, and the arrival of water was met as a blessing. So how did these two regions share their experiences with water? Archaeological records show that some agricultural tools in Mesopotamia resembled those in the Indus in form. Similarities have been found especially between plowshares and stone weights. Even if these similarities do not indicate a direct technological transfer, they suggest that similar solutions were produced for similar needs. But more striking is that some irrigation bowls found in small villages in Mesopotamia were made from stone types peculiar to the Indus region. These stones are not local. They must have come from afar. Perhaps as a trade good, perhaps brought by a migrant artisan. And here you realize, water shapes not only where it is found, but also the life around it. Therefore, a water transport technique can reach another geography without recognizing borders. People who cultivate the same land, even if they don't see each other, can find similar answers to the same questions. One day, walking along a stone canal in the Indus Valley, you see a mark carved into the wall, a bowl symbol surrounded by wave motifs. You remember that the same motif was found on the edge of a pot in Mesopotamia. This commonality shows you not only an aesthetic taste but also a common way of thinking. Perhaps this bowl meant water is held here. Perhaps it meant this area is sacred. Although the meaning is not certain, the intention is common: to remember water, to protect water. Both civilizations had learned to cope with drought. The Indus people had adopted the practice of not cult. Will this water nourish his field today? Or will it come in excess and sweep away the seeds? This scene may have been repeated countless times in both the Indus Valley and Mesopotamia. But the fundamental difference between them lies in who controlled this water and in whose name it flowed. In the Indus Valley, settlement plans stood out with a water system that extended to individual houses. Almost every house in the cities had a well or a canal connection. This water was used not only for irrigation but also for cleaning, cooling, and rituals. The large water reservoirs and stone-lined cisterns unearthed in Dolavira were physical evidence of the care this society showed for water. But what was interesting was that all these structures were large, but unostentatious. As if here, water management was a collective responsibility. No monumental temples or royal statues. Only canals directing water and people keeping them clean. In Mesopotamia, water was managed by a more centralized system. The distribution of water channels was determined by large city-states, and this distribution was documented in written records. There were water taxes. Every farmer gave a portion of their produce according to the area of land they irrigated. Temples were not only places of worship, but also centers for water and grain management. Even in the Code of Hammurabi, there were punishments for farmers who failed to fulfill their responsibilities regarding water channels. Control of water was a direct part of the social hierarchy, and this control could be monitored through writing. These differences shaped the two societies' relationship with water. In the Indus, water represented horizontal sharing. In Mesopotamia, it was a symbol of a vertical control mechanism. In the Indus, the system was integrated into individuals' daily lives. In Mesopotamia, the system progressed with the decisions. Similarly, some stone canals in Mesopotamia have the same slope calculations as those in the Indus. This engineering knowledge was either shared or arose from similar responses to similar difficulties. Here, the idea emerges that water systems also played a role in transferring knowledge. Along with trade routes, technical knowledge may also have been transported. A different irrigation technique might have been mentioned on a merchant ship, and this technique might have been tried in another city. A farmer in that city might have adapted that system to his own land. Knowledge is not always transmitted through books, but through observation. But over time, this flow of information slowed down. Why? Like seals, water systems also became isolated over time. The abandonment of Indus cities was likely due to climate change. Rivers dried up, rainfall decreased. As water dwindled, the structure of society deteriorated. Mesopotamia managed to last longer. But there, too, problems like salinization, excessive canal use, and floods began to emerge. The abundance of water eventually turned into a threat. At this point, the fate of both civilizations was tied to the fate of the rivers. For a farmer, if the flow of water stopped, time had also stopped. And in this silence, not only the land cracks, history also cracks. The memory of rivers is perhaps longer than human memory. But with time it too fades, and now I ask you, if water stops one day, what will societies stand on? And if water tells a story, can we still hear it? Time passed. Rivers flowed, but some veered from their ancient paths and dried up. Some cities were abandoned, others were quietly buried under the earth. And one morning, thousands of years later, when an archaeologist struck a pickaxe against the wall of a lost canal beneath the soil, he first encountered a dry crack. The water was no longer there. However, these migrations caused the old order to be slowly forgotten. Small temples dedicated to water gods built on the edges of fields were abandoned. Tablets on which water sharing was written were left to decay. And daily life, shaped by water, took on another form without it. Today, looking at the ancient waterways found in the Indus Valley or Mesopotamia, it is understood that these systems were astonishingly developed. Stone-lined canals, calculated slopes, the arrangement of cisterns. These infrastructures carry not only engineering, but also a societal memory. And you now realize that water had carried not only the land, but also time. So what does this memory tell us today? Many rivers today are diverted by humans, held by dams, their courses altered. Global warming threatens water resources. Fertile plains are under the pressure of industrialization. The water needs of modern cities leave rural areas dry. And this picture remarkably resembles the past. The memory of the river might this time be warning the future. Historically, the control of water allowed societies to rise, but it also prepared their collapse. When water receded in the Indus Valley, cities collapsed. When water became abundant in Mesopotamia, the land deteriorated. So both its scarcity and its excess posed a danger. Today, we are on a similar trajectory. But perhaps the real issue lies in how these civilizations thought about water. The Indus people managed water like a right, a common heritage. Mesopotamia, on the other hand, controlled water as a resource, a power. And perhaps the lesson remaining for us today is to remember that water is not just a physical but a cultural entity. Sitting by a stone canal, you watch a dusty leaf fall into the water with a gentle breeze. The water carries it, turns it, then slowly takes it away, just like the stories of these civilizations. And a question echoes in your mind. If rivers could speak one day, what would they tell us? And would we be ready to listen to that silence? As the first light of morning cast a soft glow on the stone pavements of the Potter's Street in Harappa, no one had spoken yet. This silence was not born of sleep. It was a silence born of concentration. In a corner of the courtyard, an old artisan, kneeling, turned the damp clay between his palms. His fingers moved with practiced habit, smoothing the surface with a water-soaked cloth, then carefully opening the mouth of the pot. These movements had been repeated thousands of times, but each time was rethought. You are witnessing a story that begins here, in this workshop. You feel the past imbued in the clay. You see the trace of a time, a culture, in every pot being shaped. Because pottery is not just an object, it is both the silent carrier of daily life and a historical memory. In the Indus Valley or Mesopotamia, it doesn't matter. Pottery is something touched, used, replaced when broken, but never forgotten. Pottery found in the cities of the Indus Valley stands out with its simple forms and regular patterns. Geometric motifs, usually made with black paint on a red background, were used. These patterns sometimes flow in a wave form, sometimes resemble a honeycomb, and sometimes are arranged in regular dots. Each motif was made not randomly, but with a certain understanding, perhaps the product of an aesthetic taste, perhaps a sign language, or perhaps just a tradition. But in any case, it was drawn thoughtfully. In Mesopotamia, there was a wider variety. Pottery production throughout the Sumerian, Akkadian, and later Babylonian periods developed technically and diversified. Early Sumerian pots had thick walls and simple forms. Later workshops yielded thin-walled, intricately decorated vessels. Additionally, stamped, sealed pottery fragments became part of Mesopotamia's commercial system. But the most striking similarity between these two civilizations lies not in the shapes of the pottery, but in their use and production process. In the Indus Valley, an artisan would extract material from the clay pit in the early morning, mix it with water, and spread it in small lumps to dry in the sun. The dried lumps would be kneaded by hand, placed on the wheel, and formed. Each step required a mastery gained through experience. The same was true for potters in Mesopotamia. A master working in a workshop on the Euphrates bank would leave his plough and go to the potter's wheel in the afternoon, producing the day's orders: water jars, grain containers, small offering bowls. Each was made for a different need but with a similar technique. As you observe this production process, you realize that pottery tells what a society needs. Large storage jars indicate surplus production and hoarding. Small offering vessels point to the existence of rituals. Handleless pots facilitate transport. Those with pointed bases are designed to be easily placed in sandy ground. So form is directly linked to function. In Indus and Mesopotamian cities, the areas where pottery was found are also similar. Piles of pottery in marketplaces, water jars at house entrances, offering vessels in temple courtyards. Even in some tombs, pottery left with the dead suggests that these items served not only life, but also the afterlife. In this respect, pottery is not just an object but a symbol. Something that comes from the artisan's hand now becomes part of ritual, belief, and society. But the real silence is hidden in these artisans themselves. Neither in Mesopotamia's cuneiform tablets nor in Indus seals is the name of a potter mentioned. They are the unseen hands of history, They have no statues in victory monuments nor inscriptions on their tombs. But the vessels they made are still unearthed, folk. When you look at a pot, you no longer just see clay. You feel that it was part of a life, that it played a role in the rhythm of a home, that a mother stirred her morning soup with it. It is no longer an object, but a memory. And this memory sometimes speaks through lines, sometimes through burn marks, and sometimes through its cracks. It is silent but clear. It is broken but tells a story. It is nameless but familiar. So why didn't such similar traditions of craftsmanship merge? Why were Indus motifs never completely imitated in Mesopotamia? And why did these two civilizations remain separate, even with their pottery? Perhaps the answer lies in the nature of pottery itself. A pot can only be made with the clay of its own land, and the language of each soil is unique. The potter's hands are covered in mud, but his gaze is clear. Every finger movement seems to speak an invisible language. He is silent because he needs no words. Every time he sits at the wheel, he shapes the earth into the form of the past. For he does not merely make vessels, he sculpts the voids that carry life within them. You are now this artisan's apprentice for a day. You sit on a stone at the edge of the Dolavira workshop watching. The master does not look at you, but he knows you are watching. You see the notch he presses with his hands on the edge of the water pot. That is the measurement mark. When he widens the mouth, he leaves a slight protrusion. That's for ease of pouring. There is knowledge in every movement, but this knowledge is not written. It is not a transmitted rule, but an intuition shaped by repetition. This intuition develops not only with individual mastery, but also with the needs of society. Standard vessels, seen in the orderly city plans of the Indus Valley, seem to have been made from the same mold. What this means is, production is collective, not individual. The same. In Mesopotamia, the phrase potter appears in some documents. However, this profession is often mentioned alongside other crafts: stonework, seal carving, plough repair. This indicates that pottery was as much a part of daily skill as it was a specialized field, and these skills were usually passed down within the family. The master passed it to his son. The apprentice watched not his master's hand, but his shadow. One morning, smoke rises from a pottery workshop in Ur. The kiln is heated, products are lined up. On one side, vessels, on the other, figurines. The figurines represent not gods, but ordinary people. A seated woman, a man holding his head, a figure carrying a child. These products show that the potter also incorporated his observations of society. He not only produces goods, he shapes what he sees. Some pottery found in the Indus has small holes. These are not for ventilation, not decoration. Perhaps they are marks, perhaps a symbol system, perhaps a lineage mark, perhaps a local language for the date of production. No one speaks on the pot, but it establishes its own language. And as you try to understand that language, you realize this: potters are history's first anthropologists. They perceive society's needs, preferences, rituals, but they don't write them down. They shape them. Over time, some pottery traveled to other places, carried by trade, taken along with migration. Indus origin pottery fragments found in Mesopotamia are evidence of this. However, these fragments are usually broken, no longer functional, with chipped edges. This indicates that these pots were brought for use. That is, they traveled for practical, not aesthetic reasons. But every broken piece is a trace of a journey. You now pick up a pottery fragment. On it are a few scratches, a faded motif. The broken edges are rough, but the inner part is still smooth. Fingerprints can still be faintly felt. Perhaps the master made this in a hurry. Perhaps an order was being fulfilled. Perhaps it was just an ordinary day. But this ordinariness is history itself, because it is not grand narratives, it is small repetitions that shape societies. And then a question appears in your mind. Why was the invisible labor of artisans never told? Why do they have no names, yet their works are everywhere? Perhaps this is history's most silent justice. Your name is forgotten, but what you touched remains. In a dusty archaeological trench, a diligent researcher carefully brushes away the surface soil and uncovers a pottery fragment. Broken, but its shape is still discernible, faded lines on its outer surface, clearly a motif carefully worked in its time. On its side, a protrusion left by the artisan's hands. No document tells who he was, but this trace whispers that this person once lived, thought, felt. Time wears away, but the fingerprint remains. This is the true legacy of pottery, leaving a mark without leaving a name. You are now a museum visitor in this story. Bowls, jars, figurines lined up behind glass display cases, under each a brief description. Mesopotamia, c. 2000 BCE. Indus Valley, c. 2300 BCE. These sentences are short, but behind them are hundreds of years, the labor, dreams, and habits of thousands of people. Pottery is the form of these habits, and now, through your eyes, it comes to life a second time. But you realize something. These pots are not at the center of the histories being told. They are at the periphery. They are not in the sections recounting great kings, wars, and conquests. They are in the small corners of home life, daily life. Because history is mostly a narrative written by those who speak loudly, whereas pottery is the record of life quietly shaped. Even today, pottery fragments are among the most common remains found in
archaeological work, and these fragments serve as a key to unraveling the rhythm of history.
Because what a society ate, how it stored food, how much it produced and consumed, what materials and motifs it preferred, all are hidden in these fragments, just like a small note written in the margin of a diary. Soot on a pottery fragment shows how fire was used in that society, residue inside a vessel from which plant the drink was made, a pattern, the aesthetic understanding, a crack, the habit of use. And these fragments do not just provide information, they also provide contact. When you touch that fragment, you meet a person who touched it thousands of years ago, and this contact is the simplest, truest relationship established with history. The similarity of some pottery fragments found in the Indus Valley to those found in Mesopotamia suggests that these two great civilizations shared not just products but ideas, forms, patterns, production methods. Some of these may not be direct transfers, but both are shaped by the human relationship with nature, with material, with necessity, and this relationship knows no bounds. So why did this craft knowledge disappear over time? One reason is its unwritten nature. Artisans transmitted most of their knowledge orally. Apprentices learned by observation. Writing was the domain of rulers, priests, merchants. The artisan was silent. Their knowledge was like a pot. If it falls, it breaks. If it's not passed on, it's lost. That's why many techniques, many motifs, many methods disappeared over time. But their traces remained. And these traces still live on today. Today, some traditional ceramic masters continue to make pottery using methods from thousands of years ago. How to knead the clay, when to add water, at what speed the wheel should turn. Most of this is transmitted through oral tradition. Many techniques are more precise than modern measuring instruments because they rely on intuition, experience, and patience.
When you sit beside these masters, you feel as if you are in a workshop in Dola Vera or Ur. The same smells, the same sounds. As hands repeat the same movements, time bends, and suddenly history touches the present. Today, pottery fragments in museums exist not just for display, they are there to be learned from. Archaeologists try to understand society's behaviors, relationships, and reactions to the environment through every new pattern, every new form. Because pottery shows not only what we lived with, but how we lived. And now I will show you one last scene. A child, wandering through an excavation site, trips over a piece of stone, bends down, picks it up. It is a small fragment broken from a pot. Its pattern is gone, its color faded, but the child holds it in his palm. Without knowing that the piece once belonged to a home, perhaps passed through a mother's hands, perhaps was part of an offering, he touches it with an instinctive respect. This touch is the true transmission of history. And you, amidst all this silence, think this: if history is only what is written, then why were all the artisans forgotten? And if a pot can still speak thousands of years later, are we listening to it enough? One day in the Sindh region, an archaeologist walking along one of the dried-up branches of the Indus Valley finds an unusual piece of stone in the soil. This stone is neither a seal nor an ornament. There is no writing on it, but its corners are so perfectly straight, its edges so evenly carved, that it is immediately clear this is not merely an aesthetic stone, this is a weight. And as you pick it up, you realize this stone represents something, value. It is the symbol of the scale and the measure of balance. Around the same period, a similar stone is unearthed in Lagash, a city in southern Mesopotamia, of the same size, carved in a similar way. However, a few cunays.
Form marks are etched on this stone. These marks indicate how many mina or shekel it is worth. These small stones held an important place within Mesopotamia's complex system of measurement. And here, something interesting happens. Two civilizations, thousands of kilometers apart, with different languages, different beliefs, yet they appear to be using the same weight values. When you place these stones side by side, you realize they are weighing not just mass, but also a mentality, a structured, systematic, standardized way of thinking. Because to measure is not just to measure goods, gold, grain, it is also to shape justice, equality, and mutual trust. Small weights found in Indus Valley excavations are usually cubic in form. The type of stone is generally schist or limestone. They were made to standard dimensions, and this standard is the same as the weights in other cities thousands of kilometers away. This indicates the existence of a decentralized system that functioned like a centralized one. It's as if the cities, while independent internally, had agreed on a common unit of weight. So how was this possible? In the Indus Valley, the script has not been deciphered. No text states, this unit of weight is such and such, but the stones are of the same measure. This points to an unwritten agreement. Perhaps it was formed through experience on trade routes, perhaps a balance that settled over time. Merchants, seeing this stone, knew its value. This information was not written, but it existed in the shared memory of hand, eye, and mind. In Mesopotamia, this process is more visible. Weight units are frequently encountered on tablets: mina, shekel, talent. Each is linked to the others by a specific ratio. For example, 60 shekels make 1 mina. These ratios were valid not only for the economy but also for temple offerings and state records, because their measure was used not only in the market but also in administration. You imagine a Mesopotamian merchant placing a stone weight on one pan of the scale in the morning market and on the other pan pouring wheat, cloth, or lapis lazuli. When the scale balances, the transaction is complete, but this equality establishes a balance not only between goods but also between people. On the same day, thousands of kilometers to the east, in the port of Lothal, another merchant performs a similar action. He places a small weight in his hand on one side of the scale and a small bag full of precious stones on the other. And when the scale balances, the transaction is silently completed. Here, too, there is no writing. But there is balance, and where there is balance, there is trust. This common system of weights surprises historians because two civilizations without a direct diplomatic relationship, cultural unity, or a single center of administration were using the same measures of balance. This shows us trade comes before culture, and weight is understood before language. When you look at these stones behind a glass display in a museum, you feel that they carry not just shape, but meaning. Because these stones tell how much people trusted each other, what they exchanged for what, and what was considered valuable. In the Indus Valley, some weights are marked with symmetrical lines. These might be indicators of proportion. Perhaps one stone is a quarter or an eighth the value of another. This system could be used not only for weighing, but also for division. Sharing is fair only if there is a measure. In Mesopotamia, on the other hand, only specific types of weights were used in some temples. This meant separating sacred goods from commercial goods. Sometimes god names were inscribed on these stones, sometimes just a sacred symbol. Because there, goods offered to the gods were also measured. Measure was intertwined not only with economy but also with belief. But over time, the measurement systems deteriorated. When cities in the Indus Valley were abandoned, weights also became dysfunctional. In Mesopotamia, differences in measurement began to appear between different cities. Weighing systems became localized, and this localization slowed down trade. Because when a common language is lost, exchange becomes difficult. Today, the basis of international trade is still unity of measurement. The fact that a kilogram, a liter, a meter mean the same thing worldwide is the modern continuation of this silent agreement that began in the Indus and Mesopotamia. But you think if these stones could speak, on which scale would they say who weighed more? And are we still being weighed with the same stones today, or has the scale already tilted? You are walking through a marketplace. The ground is dirt, the stalls are stone. The sun is high, and the air is heavy. You are in a city in the Indus Valley, perhaps Harappa, perhaps Lothal. In every corner, a different good is sold. Grains in cloth bags, copper bracelets, small stone beads, baked clay figurines. But your eye is on a man's scale. On one pan is a polished stone, cube-shaped, its edges carefully smoothed. Slowly, a handful of wheat is poured into the other pan. When the scale balances, the man nods his head. The transaction is complete. This small scene is not just a trade between two people. This scene is the rebuilding of trust, order, and common understanding, because the scale is not just about goods, it is about relationships. And this relationship is one of the cornerstones of social structures. Weight systems created a common economic memory between distant civilizations like Mesopotamia and the Indus Valley. These systems were used not only for the exchange of goods, but also in every area of daily life, such as taxation, labor planning, temple offerings, and food distribution. In Mesopotamia, some clay tablets written in C uniform contain detailed calculations based on weight. One tablet reads, 12 minas of barley offered to the temple of Ur, 2 minas allocated to the god Enki, 10 minas distributed to the workers. This is not just an inventory, it is also a document explaining how society functioned. Weight shows how society was distributed. In the Indus Valley, on the other hand, we do not have such written documents, but the existence of standardized weights indicates that the same function was performed by a different system. Perhaps each city had common measuring stones, perhaps each market had a central officer who checked them, perhaps verifying the weight system was related to a person's reputation. Because the accuracy of a stone is the accuracy of the merchant. You are now in a modern archaeological laboratory to examine these stones. Dozens of small weights lined up side by side, some from the Indus, some from Mesopotamia. All are simple, most have no marks on them. But their dimensions are so precise that the differences between them are at the gram level. This precision is not just artisan skill, it is also a reflection of a society's understanding of accuracy. So, why was such precision necessary? Because a deviation disrupts not only a transaction, but also the balance within a community. Think, if a scale breaks, the rich get richer, the poor get poorer. Where equality is disturbed, trust is also shaken. That is why weights are not just an economic tool, but an ethical one. In Mesopotamia, statues of justice were found at some city gates. These statues featured figures holding scales. These figures symbolize not only divine justice, but also the sacredness of earthly measure, because people are weighed, because one who measures correctly lives correctly. In the Indus Valley, there are no such monumental structures, but some seals feature human figures carrying symbols resembling stones or scales in their hands. The meaning of these figures is unknown. Nevertheless, these symbols are thought to represent a kind of order. Perhaps these seals indicated reliable merchants or individuals who guaranteed standards. As you examine these symbols, you realize this. Societies used measure not only for economics but also for morality. A stone was carried not only for how many grams it weighed, but also to show who you were. Weight also became an indicator of status. Especially in Mesopotamia, merchants carrying large amounts of weight could enter wider markets, be represented in temples, and approach rulers. They carried not just goods, they carried trust, because large trade meant great responsibility, and great responsibility began with weighing correctly. In the Indus, this system appears more egalitarian. The formal uniformity of weights indicates that every merchant operated within the same system. This suggests that control came not from a center, but from the common habits of society. Perhaps here reputation was defined by harmony rather than individual achievement. But over time, this harmony broke down. In some late layers of the Indus Valley, weights are seen deviating from standards. Differences emerge between stones that should be of the same size. This indicates that an order was beginning to unravel. Similar situations occurred in Mesopotamia. During wars, migrations, and changes in administration, measurement systems fragmented. New cities established their own weights. This reduced trust in trade, and once broken, it is difficult to return to the old ways, because measure is the balance not only of goods, but also of society. In the modern world today, weighing systems are still part of an order. Even at the foundation of international systems, common units of measurement are in place, but we sometimes forget the historical burden of these units. Yet a kilogram is not just weight, it is the continuation of a system of trust shaped by the hands of thousands of people in the past. And you ask yourself, if everyone in a society measures with different stones, is justice possible there? And are we still weighing with the same measure today, or is no one controlling the scale anymore? History is often written with victories, wars, and the names of great leaders, but now you pick up a small stone that lies outside those grand narratives, a weight, no king's seal on it, no god's name. But this small stone, perhaps in the lives of thousands of people, represents a common, silent agreement. This much, no less, no more. No lie, no exaggeration, just as it should be. This is the essence of measure. You are in a modern museum today. You are looking at the weights displayed behind glass. Lined up side by side, some are dark grey, some light brown. The corners of some are worn, some are still sharp. But all of them once bore the foundation of a society. Perhaps in a marketplace, perhaps in a temple, perhaps in a tax office. These stones have historically been not only tools of measurement, but also symbols of remaining in balance. The weights found in the Indus Valley are mostly cube or rectangular prism-shaped. Each is carefully crafted, polished, and the ratios between them show an extraordinary consistency when compared to the modern gram system. Such a clear standard in a date like 2500 BCE, this indicates a developed social organization, but more importantly, it points to a culture of silent consensus. In Mesopotamia, on the other hand, stones were sometimes inscribed. Expressions like one mina, one hahal shekel, were carved in cuneiform. These inscriptions indicate that the stone was approved by an institution, perhaps passed through the inspection of an official. Measure here is not just a function, it is a symbol of authority. Writing controls measure, and writing represents a hierarchy. But in both civilizations there is a common theme: accuracy, because measure establishes a bond not only between units but also between people. When you touch these stones, you feel that bond still persists. In the modern world today, standards still regulate every aspect of life: weights, lengths, durations, voltages, temperatures. And at the root of these systems are those small stones. They were the first links in the chain of trust that a society built within itself. However, in those times, this trust was supported not only by a physical measure, but also by a cultural understanding. For example, it is believed that in the Indus, there was an area in the central part of the markets where large weights were displayed. Everyone would look at these stones before making a purchase, comparing them with their own stone. This was a silent control mechanism. There might not have been a state, but there was a collective memory. This memory would pass to every individual, every market, every generation. In Mesopotamia, this system was more official. Weighing centers were of great importance, especially in cities where the temple economy was strong. Merchants who measured incorrectly were punished. Some tablets contain phrases like, "A person who cheats with incorrect measure loses all his goods." So here, measure was directly linked not only with economics, but also with morality and justice. Now, as you return to the present, you question the traces left by these stones. Why is the sacredness of measure no longer felt so strongly? Why do scales continue to operate unchecked? And can we still uphold the same balance? These questions are not only historical, they concern today and tomorrow as well. Because measure, whether it is a stone or a law, is the invisible line that holds society together. If that line is lost, everything is lost. Because the greatness of a civilization is measured not by how much land it conquered, but by how fairly it weighed. And as you ponder this last sentence, you realize how great a burden a small weight stone has carried throughout history. Perhaps the heaviest thing is hidden in the smallest stone. Morning hasn't fully broken yet. As the sun slowly rises from behind distant hills, you walk through the narrow streets of a city in the Indus Valley. Under your feet are neatly paved stones, around you simple but sturdy mud brick walls. Everything is orderly, placed according to a specific plan, it seems. Houses are lined up side by side, neither too big nor too small. Doors mostly open not to the street, but to side courtyards. There are no windows, but enough light filters in. A neighborhood silence prevails, but this silence is not inactivity. It is the sound of order. This is the most striking feature of Indus cities: planned architecture. This does not happen by chance. It is the result of a perspective. The size of the houses, the width of the streets, the direction of the wastewater channels, all are in harmony with each other. And you realize that these cities were designed not just for living, but for living together. Now you cross thousands of kilometers to the west, to Mesopotamia, Eridu, or Nippur. Here too you encounter a similar scene: narrow streets, close walls, small inner courtyards. However, Here the houses embrace the streets more. The layouts are more cramped, the passages more winding. But still there is a balance inside. Although the house may appear chaotic from the outside, it carries a symmetrical tranquility within. In both civilizations, the architecture of the home is not just for shelter, it is also a mirror of a social order. The vast majority of houses found in the Indus Valley contain a water drainage system. This is in the form of small, stone-paved channels or terracotta pipes. These systems carry dirty water from inside the house to the outside, often underground. Small kitchen area. On the side, a stone mortar. Spices were likely ground in it. Small sitting stones lean against the walls. The ceiling has collapsed, but the ground still speaks. Footsteps once echoing in the house, not laughter, but the sound of regular movement. Everything is simple but functional. Now, you enter a house in Mesopotamia in the same way. This house has higher walls. Its door opens to the street. Inside, there's a large storage area. In the adjacent rooms, sleeping areas, a cooking area in one corner, a small fire pit in the middle. But there are more traces on the walls, carved symbols, perhaps notes. This house is not just a living space, it is also a place where records were kept. Perhaps a merchant's house, perhaps a scribe's. And here you realize that the Indus house is a carrier of silent order. The Mesopotamian house, on the other hand, is the stage for a narrative. So how did these differences arise, and more importantly, did these differences eventually come into contact? Some archaeologists observe that certain house plans found in Mesopotamia resemble the courtyard houses in the Indus Valley. Especially in cities along trade routes, such architectural mixtures are seen. This may not be a direct transfer, but it shows that ideas traveled as much as goods. You can imagine this with an example. A merchant arrives in Ur from Lothal. He sees the crowded houses there. He observes the streets. But he misses the layout of his own home. And he decides to build a house there with a central courtyard, walls that let in light, a small but functional structure. Over time, this house is noticed. Neighbors become curious. And perhaps years later, another person adopts the same plan. This is how architecture spreads, not by copying, but by being noticed. And a house is the portable form of an idea. But one day, these ideas fall silent. Indus ties are abandoned. Houses remain buried under the earth. Cities in Mesopotamia are reshaped by wars, and the voices inside the houses cease. But the earth does not forget. Today, a layer of ash found on the floor of a house tells of a fire, a hidden cavity in a wall of a hidden object, a lamp found in a niche of nights, and a doorstep of thousands of passing feet. These are silent, but they all speak. And you now ask yourself, when a house loses its walls, what remains? If a society cannot transmit its inner voice to the outside, who hears it? The house you stand in is now empty. Its walls have crumbled, its roof collapsed, only its foundations remain. But this emptiness is not the absence of the past, it is the silence of the past. Because architecture carries not only the moment it was built, but also the moments it was lived. And you are now listening to this empty house, not with steps, but with your eyes, not by hearing, but by feeling. The spatial arrangement within a house reflects how a society thought and how it related. That is why the houses of the Indus and Mesopotamian civilizations are not just shelters, but spatial projections of collective thought.
In the Indus Valley, a house was largely shaped by the internal rhythm of a family. Courtyards were spaces where children could play, women could work, and men could rest. These spaces were not closed off, but they were kept out of sight. Between neighboring houses there was not a wall, but a silent agreement. Your interior space, your privacy. Windows opening to the street were few. The house turned inwards. This suggests that the community prioritized private space. Perhaps this is why there are no palaces or grand monuments in Indus cities. Social life was organized within the home. In Mesopotamia, the social role of the house was broader. A house was not only for the family, but also a center
For production and storage, not only was food cooked in the house, but goods were stored, work was done, guests were entertained. The house was a small economic unit. That is why the walls were thicker, the rooms more functional. These structures combined individual existence with social function, and this combination shows that the house was both introverted and extroverted. As you compare these two forms of housing, you understand that architecture is built not only with stone, but also with thought. The large water canals and reservoirs that emerged in the Indus Valley were not just external systems, they were part of the internal architecture, because every house was positioned to support that system. Structures on the same plane, in the same alignment, facing the same direction. This suggests a central authority in city planning, but also indicates that the populace had adopted this order. Because people continued to live within this structure, they did not resist. It means that this architecture became an extension of life. In Mesopotamia, on the other hand, city planning was more complex. Main roads led to temples, ziggurats, and market areas. But the location of houses was often determined by functionality. This shows individual preference. A merchant wanted to be near the marketplace, a priest near the temple, an artisan near the kiln. This diversity is the reflection of social differentiation in space. That is, the location of the house also determined your status. So, was there any contact between these architectural systems? Some findings suggest that small groups migrating from the Indus Valley to Mesopotamia also implemented their own house structures in new locations. Especially in settlements along trade routes, Indus-type courtyard houses are found. These structures sometimes blended with local architecture and sometimes maintained their original unique form. This shows that architecture could move not only as stone, but also as the idea carried by stone. As you sit by a stone wall, you notice the traces on the wall, a carved line, a marker stone placed on top of another, a window adjusted according to the sun. These are small details, but they form a whole. Just as a poem is written not only with words, but also with pauses, with silences, architecture, too, sometimes speaks with what it does not say. Today, archaeologists are trying to decipher these silent narratives. A house plan tells the structure of a society, the size of the rooms, the size of the family, the shape of the courtyard, daily rituals, because architecture puts the invisible into form. The thickness of the walls of Indus houses was not only for insulation. Perhaps it was for privacy. The direction of the doorway was not only according to the wind, perhaps it was determined by the neighbor. These are unwritten but lived decisions. In Mesopotamian houses, on the other hand, small shelves, incense burners, or niches, sometimes found in rooms, suggest that a house had not only a physical but also a spiritual function. Perhaps a prayer was said here every morning. Perhaps a lamp was lit every evening. These small architectural details carry the traces of a lifestyle. And you realize that a house is not just a place where one lives. A house is also a thought-out space, and this thought speaks with the inner voice of society. Today, this legacy still lives on in the modern world, inner courtyards in apartment buildings, preferences for west-facing windows, balconies that face or don't face the street. These are not just aesthetic decisions, they are silent continuations of ways of life stretching back thousands of years. But now, these voices often get lost in the noise. In newly built buildings, no one thinks about orientation. There are no windows following the sun. Courtyards protecting privacy have dwindled, and the house has become just a place to stay. So how did we lose this architectural memory, and can we hear the silent voice within the house again? Perhaps the answer lies not in the stones of the past. It is hidden in the walls of today. Throughout history, a home has been not merely a place of shelter, but a ground where a society's values, beliefs, and customs were shaped. And now you walk on this ground. The stones beneath your feet might have once tripped a child's toy thousands of years ago, or witnessed a mother's morning preparations. Perhaps they hosted a merchant's morning prayer. Architectural historians have long known that the homes of the Indus Valley and Mesopotamia carried not only a physical but also a social function. Each home was a world unto itself, but also an extension of that world within a larger system. Thus, a small architectural preference in one house sometimes reflected the entire life philosophy of a civilization. In the Indus Valley, the uniform construction of every house was not just a technical convenience. This order was the result of a common understanding, an egalitarian way of thinking. The similarity of every house was considered an indicator of their being on the same social level. No one should appear significantly larger or richer than another's house. This was an unwritten but living architecture of social equality. In Mesopotamia, the situation was slightly different. There, the size, function, and location of the house were a reflection of social status. Priests' houses were usually near temples, merchants' houses near markets. Villagers and artisans lived closer to the city walls. This distinction was also reflected in the architecture. Multi-roomed, high-ceilinged houses and single-roomed, low structures were rarely found in the same neighborhood. This showed that Mesopotamia harbored a more hierarchical social structure. So, what happened when these two different understandings of the home came together? Archaeological excavations, particularly along trade routes on the Iranian plateau, revealed hybrid structures where Indus-type introverted planning A and Mesopotamian-type multifunctional rooms were combined. In these houses, sometimes a courtyard reflected a silent inner life, while another part of the same structure could be transformed into a small trade shop. This showed that the spatial thinking of the two cultures, rather than excluding each other, organically merged. You might now be standing on the foundations of such a house. Its stones may not be in place, but its orientation is still clear. The wind still passes through the same street. The sun still rises from the same spot. And when you close your eyes, you can imagine the life within that house. A child playing with water in the courtyard, a woman sitting by the inner wall, grinding grain, a man cutting fabric in a small room, a stranger waiting at the outer door to enter. These are not grand events, but they are small scenes that form the backbone of history, silent but enduring. In today's world, however, the home has largely become a consumer object. Architecture is shaped by global aesthetics rather than local needs. Balconies look at advertisements, not the city. Windows open to traffic, not the wind. Interior layouts are determined by real estate value, not personal preferences. And we are slowly losing the architectural language of the past. But perhaps that language is not completely lost. Perhaps you still feel something in the silence when you step into a courtyard. Perhaps a warmth still fills you when you look at the light from a window. Perhaps you still hesitate a little when crossing a small threshold. Because architecture is built not only with stone, but with memory. And that memory is within you. The water flowing in Indus houses, the incense burning in Mesopotamian rooms might be echoing in the corner of your own home today. Perhaps you are unaware, but that sound is there. And perhaps what we need most right now is this: to hear our homes again. Because the homes of the past were not just places lived in, they were living thoughts. And these thoughts continue to live long after the stones have crumbled. Let us now enter one of the places where silence has been heard best throughout history: temples. As you take that first step, your footfall echoing on the stone floor resonates not only with you, but also with those who have walked these paths for thousands of years. Every step is as silent as a prayer, as heavy as a decision. Although most are now ruined or buried in silence, the temples in Mesopotamia and the Indus Valley were once the heartbeat of a city. But these temples were somewhat different from the magnificent places of worship that come to your mind. The function of these structures was not limited to religious ceremonies. They were also at the center of social, economic, and political structures. In the silence of a temple, in fact, the entire order of a society was hidden. You now enter the heart of Mesopotamia, into one of the narrow streets of Uruk or Nippur. The heat in the air is oppressive, but the stone walls offer some coolness. As you approach the temple, the sound of the crowd diminishes. People here are more cautious, slower, more measured, because reaching the foot of the ziggurat requires not only a physical journey, but also a spiritual preparation. In Mesopotamia, temples were often built on high platforms. This meant being closer to the gods. Each level was like a step towards the sky. The topmost level was a sacred area that only priests could ascend. Ceremonies, prophecies, astrological calculations were performed there. When you touch the stones of these structures, you feel not just a wall, but the fear, hope, and expectation of thousands of people. Outside the ziggurats, the rhythm of daily life was adjusted according to the temple. Merchants would offer sacrifices to the goddess before opening their shops. Farmers would not harvest their crops before taking them to the temple granary. Thus, the temple was not just a center of belief, but an apparatus of control and guidance. Priests were the silent rulers of a city. Scribes worked here, rulers consulted here, the people sought answers here. When we come to the Indus Valley, things are a little different. Here we do not have as clear structures and texts about temples as in Mesopotamia. However, the Great Bath at Mohenjo-Daro shows that ritual cleanliness and religious symbols were important in this society as well. The small rooms around this structure and the carefully planned drainage system were the product not only of a practical order, but also of a deep symbolism. The silence of the Indus Valley is quite different from the complexity of Mesopotamia's written narratives. While Mesopotamia engraved prayers, prophecies, lists of gods, and sacrificial rituals on tablets for us, the Indus people left behind mostly stones, water, and structures. We do not know what they called their gods, but we can see how they lived. Is this not a form of worship? As you walk through a temple area in the Indus, your voice blends more with the earth. The stones beneath your feet haven't risen as high as in Mesopotamia, but they still elevate you to a thought. Could this silence be a sign not of an absence, but of an awareness? These two cultures, kilometers apart, may have attributed different meanings to their temples, but they still shared a common vein, placing the sacred at the center of society. This sacredness was expressed sometimes with fear, sometimes with peace, but in both cases they had to accept a power beyond the individual. Temples, for you, might be a travel destination, a ruin, an ancient structure, but they were once places where people surrendered their daily worries, desires, and fears. A prayer for a child's recovery, an offering made for a lost item, an appeal after a bad harvest. All these, even if not preserved in stone, echo through time. In Mesopotamian temples, gods were hierarchical. Each city considered its own god as the chief god. Uruk belonged to Inanna, Nippur to Enlil, Eridu to Enki. Each god had a duty. Some represented fertility, some wisdom, some lightning. And temples were structures that concretized this representation. Every statue was as real as an idea, every offering a sign of a relationship. In the Indus, however, the gods are silent. We do not know their names, we have not deciphered their prayers, but the symbols they hold, their positions and orientations whisper something to us. These people also sought an order. Perhaps this order was not as hierarchical as Mesopotamia's. Perhaps the gods here were more intertwined with nature. But still, sacredness echoes among the stones. You are now in the shadow of a Mesopotamian temple, and also on the steps of an Indus structure. With every step, you feel a layer of the past, and these layers are keys for you to understand not only the past, but also the present. Today in modern cities, temples, mosques, churches or shrines still exist. But these structures are no longer part of the societal center, but often part of its periphery. Yet once, everything revolved around them. Today, shopping malls, roads, corporations are at the center of society. This is also a sign of a silent transformation. Perhaps the gods are still waiting somewhere, but we may have started to no longer hear those footsteps. The fact that you are reading or listening to these lines right now could even be a form of remembrance. You are trying to hear again the silence of the temples, the echo of footsteps, the memory of stones. And it is at this point that a question arises. Could it be that when we forget silence, the sacred might also forget us? As you listen to the silence, you unconsciously shift to another time. The stones of the temples now draw you beyond their walls into the ceremonies themselves. This time you are not just a visitor, you are in the footsteps of someone who lived there. Perhaps you are a scribe in Uruk, working among the priests, or someone who washes the stones of the bath in Mohenjo-daro every morning. Your day is spent not serving the gods, but maintaining order. But every small task you do is part of an act of worship. The activity beginning in a Mesopotamian temple in the early hours of the morning is not just about religious duties. Grain is brought to the temple storehouse, cattle are counted before being brought in, and the previous day's records are checked on tablets. Priests track the movement of the stars, because it is necessary to know if the coming days will be auspicious. And you, as a scribe bending over that stone floor, build a bridge between the gods and the people, but silently. Most of these writings are not prayers or myths. They are debts, deliveries, calendar records, parts of an economic order run in the name of the gods, because temples were not just centers of worship, but centers of administration. The Nana temple in Ur was not only the home of the moon god, it was also the city's largest granary. Working there meant working directly for the god. In the Indus Valley, the system operated in a different way. Hierarchy was less visible, but still a sense of order was very strong. The Great Bath in Mohenjo-daro was not only a place of purification, but probably a social gathering point. In the mornings, people silently washing here to the sounds of water were perhaps entering a purification with the first light of day. Purification was not only physical, but a spiritual transition. What stands out here is not the similarity of structures, but the commonality of functions. In both civilizations, water, cleanliness, and recurring rituals were at the core of daily life. These repetitions are more regular than the morning alarm that wakes you. Cleaning starting at the same time, offerings placed in the same way, records written with the same order. This is not monotony, this is a kind of continuity, the silent but vital cycles necessary for a society to exist. The priests were only the religious face of this cycle, but the steps they repeated every morning were taken not only for the gods, but also for the peace of the people. Rituals were effective not only within the temple, but also outside its walls. A priest was the one who silently kept a pulse on society. They were the first to notice when things were not going well, the approach of an epidemic, drought, or the threat of invasion. For this reason, in Mesopotamia, priests were not just religious leaders, but also scientists, economists, and advisors. Their observations were trusted because they tracked the stars, recorded the direction of the wind, and measured water levels. But still, behind all these calculations, there was always an unknown, a will of God. No matter how much you measure, some things only prayer could solve. The silence of writing in the Indus Valley makes these cycles even more interesting, because here we do not know the names of the temple priests, we do not know their rituals, but the relationship they established with structures, water, and roads reflects a kind of worship. The wells regularly placed in Mohenjo-Daro were built to be accessible to everyone. This could be a sign of a system where communal living was valued. Temples here exist not only for the gods, but for society as well. The community's approach to each other is as important as the individual's approach to God. Water is as sacred as God here, because life is possible with it. Therefore, the worship of this society is perhaps hidden in togetherness. You now think, could the difference between Mesopotamia's towering ziggurats and the Indus's horizontally sprawly urban layout be not just architectural but also a conceptual difference, a search for power rising to the sky in one, a desire for horizontally shared order in the other? The sacred is at the center of both, but that sacred takes shape in different ways. Among the daily repeated rituals, ordinary people also took part. A farmer would come to offer the best of his harvest. A mother would make a vow when her child fell ill. A soldier would silently touch the temple gate before battle. And the names of these people do not appear in history books, but the marks of their hands remain on the temple stones. Those stones too are silent, but have not forgotten. In Mesopotamia, the decades passing between rituals, sometimes for a lightning god, sometimes for a fertility goddess, might be just a few lines for you. But for those who lived there, these years meant waiting, wishing, and living with silence. And this silence is as real as you can hear it even now. In the Indus, these wishes were perhaps left not to writing, but to water. Every purification is a prayer, every cleansing a rebirth, and every stone a memory. But all these efforts continue to ask the same question for thousands of years. Does man try to understand the unknown or merely get used to it? You now take one last step in the shadow of time and stones. As you leave behind the heavy stone walls of the temples, you now better understand how complex and silently the life within them operated, because to understand how developed a civilization was, sometimes you need to look not at its armies or palaces, but at the interior of its temples and the silent daily life that revolved around them. The priest who awoke to morning prayers in the shadow of a temple in Ur or Nippur was no different from the worker who carried stones to the public bath at first light in Mohenjo-Daro. Both served an order greater than themselves, and the continuation of this order was sustained not only by stone or by writing, but by silent loyalty. You can see it more clearly now. That hidden relationship between Mesopotamia and the Indus Valley was not just an exchange of trade goods, it was the touching of two societies' answers to the fundamental questions of human life. Silent but systematic answers to questions like, why are we here? Who rules us? How should we live? Temples were places where these answers slowly accumulated and eventually merged with time itself. Every stone, a prayer. Every tablet, an expectation. Every drop of water drawn from a well, a hope. And then these temples, one by one, fell silent. Like ziggurats swept away by the floods of the Euphrates, like the abandoned cities of the Indus Valley. Why, we may never fully know. Was it climate change, an epidemic, or just the usual flow of time? But what remains still speaks to us. The stones found in the temple of Nana, the moon god in the ancient drainage systems still flowing through the silent streets of Mohenjo-Daro, and that unwritten but felt language of worship. These tell you not only about the past, but also about your present. Because in the city where you live now, there are also silent footsteps. Someone cleaning in the early morning, an old person praying, someone carrying water for children. They too are carriers of an order, and each of them, perhaps without even realizing it, is a link in a chain stretching back thousands of years. When Mesopotamia and the Indus Valley met, no treaty was signed between them, but through temples, waterways, and seals, a kind of silent handshake took place. This handshake was not recorded in the official records of history, but the earth remembered. It remained in the pottery, in the seals, in the stones, and in the direction of the roads. And now you, as you close your eyes, are walking down one of those roads. The stones beneath your feet carry the footsteps of thousands of years. Or perhaps one was pressed by someone going to morning prayer 1,000 years ago. Perhaps another by an Indus merchant who had come from a distant port. At the end of this story, there are no heroes. There are only ordinary people and their silent but resolute footsteps. Now, close your eyes a little tighter. Feel the coolness of those stone walls on your back. And remember, sometimes history lives in the most forgotten places, and the most silent temples leave the longest echoes. Good night, and greetings to those who walked silently through history.